Welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters. I'm June Hogan, and this is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. And today I want to talk about something that I don't think is named often enough in organisations when redundancies are happening. Because we might call redundancies a restructuring or workplace change or transformation. But thinking about it from the individual's perspective, what's really happening there is loss. And with loss can come grief. So, what I want to do today is to talk about how understanding redundancy through the lens of grief can potentially change how you lead through redundancies and how you support leaders to notice what might be going on for somebody and to enable them to support someone if they are experiencing those entirely natural reactions that will come as a result of a loss in someone's life. Now, I previously recorded a podcast about the emotion of redundancy, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And this episode today really is about building on that and going a bit deeper into the notion of grief and job loss. So I guess when most of us hear the word grief, you're going to think about bereavement, and that's entirely natural. And throughout this podcast, I'm going to be drawing on some of the work of David Kessler, who spent decades working in the field of grief. And he also has done some work alongside Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who introduced the change curve. And both of them remind us that grief isn't something that's just limited to bereavement. Because job loss is significant. It's not just about losing a salary. It's about losing identity, that sense of community, losing structure, the rhythm of a daily life, losing that sense of direction, losing hope for what the future could have held. And there's so much of our identity that is wrapped up in our jobs. It shapes how we introduce us. It shapes how we feel about ourselves in connection to others, our place in the world. And for some people, our jobs provide a sense of sanctuary and comfort from what can be difficult personal lives. So when all of that disappears, not through choice, that's when the emotions will come out. So emotions such as shock, maybe anger, could be sadness or disbelief, anxiety, the fear, overwhelm. And for some people, it can be a relief. And when you think about grief and the reaction that comes from that loss, thinking about it not as something that needs to be fixed, but thinking about it as emotions that need space and opportunity for someone to explore. And helping people through that grief and those feelings of loss is something that we do with our outplacement support services. And I see people who are grieving, some of whom recognise that and some of whom don't. And I always remember a client saying to me, who had never experienced redundancy before, they said, "Oh, does it sound strange? But I feel like I did when my grandfather died." And I said, no, it doesn't sound strange at all, because you're grieving for something that mattered. You're grieving for a job that you loved with a company that you'd worked for. This individual had been there literally their whole career. And so, yes, those feelings are very real. And those are feelings of loss and of grief that can feel very similar to when you are grieving the loss of a loved one or experiencing bereavement. So it's interesting that grief can come up for people, whether or not they realise it, whether or not they expect it. And when you're supporting individuals through those moments in those initial phases, it's really important to just give them the space and the time to just let those emotions come out and let them just be and to just sit there, which I know can be hard to do. Because it can be that our sort of natural reaction is to try and calm someone down when we see those big emotions at play that can come out in redundancy meetings or during the process itself. But when you think about the distinction between pain and suffering and grief, and that's something which David Kessler talks about, is that the pain that someone is feeling is the inevitable loss, that losing their job, and the pain, the emotion associated with that. And the suffering can come when that pain is dismissed or maybe brushed, or somebody's trying to sort of minimize it or brush it under the carpet, as it were, because the pain of redundancy is something that's real. But the suffering can tend to come when someone feels like they're kind of just being ignored, or maybe just being managed through a process rather than being treated as a person in a difficult situation. Now, it's not possible to remove the pain of redundancy because difficult decisions have to be made commercially, and I get that. But this is about understanding how you can help to minimize the suffering that somebody might be going through as a result. Okay, so what does that actually all mean in practice then? So these are a few things that can maybe bring it to life. So preparing line managers to go into redundancy conversations and understanding the legal context is very important. They need to understand that this sits within a wider process as part of employment law regulations. That's super important. They need to understand the timelines, how consultation works, the various different steps, and have a framework and potentially have a script if that's what you're going to be using. But the really important part as well is preparing them for what the emotions could be like in that conversation. And that's something which, when I was managing redundancies back in my corporate career, I didn't always pay enough attention to, because I was focused on the process and the timelines and making sure everyone had got the packs and the information, and just kind of assuming that, well, they'll know what to do in these situations. Do I need to be explicit about what to do when someone starts crying? And often then, because I was in those meetings, I would then be the person who would kind of pick up the emotion, if you like. But it's not always practical to have somebody from HR in redundancy consultation meetings. Sometimes your managers might be going to do that on their own. So one of the most helpful things that I think HR teams can do is prepare managers for that range of reactions. So they might experience somebody who is in shock. So they've glazed over, they're really not taking the information in anymore, and they've just checked out because they're just overwhelmed at hearing those words, your role is at risk of redundancy. And that's a really natural response. You might have someone who is angry. Their emotions have taken over and they're so upset, and their emotions are being driven by that notion of fear, of maybe that they're scared, maybe they just can't take it all in. So their response is to present with anger. Some people might start crying and not know why they're crying, but the crying and the tears will come. And other people will just go completely quiet, and you might not be able to get a sense of what's going on. Those are all normal reactions. But if it's about dismissing those reactions and trying to move on and move quickly through the process, then that's where that notion of people either not feeling like they've been heard, valued, or listened to, and that connection between the pain and suffering of grief that I mentioned earlier. So it can be something as simple as giving line managers some simple phrases that they can use when they might feel a bit unsure. So, for example, something like, I can see this has come as a shock. So you're acknowledging what somebody might be going through, or I can understand this is a lot to take in at the moment. And then you might go on to say, we don't have to rush this conversation. We can take a pause if you'd like, take a break. Let me know if you want me to carry on. So you're really acknowledging the individual. You're connecting with what's happening for them. You're not trying to dismiss it, move it on, or offer platitudes around, oh, well, it must be a shock, but don't worry, everything will be fine. So that kind of language allows a line manager to acknowledge what's happening, but it doesn't lead to an escalation. And it can help to give them the confidence to stay present in that emotion. And often that is just by being silent. That is just by giving someone the space to talk or express that emotion as it's coming out for them. And so one of the most important moments in that redundancy process is when someone hears that news. They hear the words, your role is at risk of redundancy. So I'd recommend that you avoid the long sort of build-ups or complicated business explanations. There's obviously got to be a sound business rationale, but it needs to be put forward clearly and simply. And then once you've delivered that bit of news, is to pause, let the person absorb what they've heard, because often they're not going to hear it all because they've gone into shock. So slowing down in that moment is important as well. And I understand that it can feel daunting to be going into that kind of meeting, not knowing the reaction that you might be faced with, and that maybe things will just spiral out of control completely. Now, that's very sort of rare that happens. I have seen lots of intense emotions when I manage redundancies in my corporate career. But when someone feels heard and acknowledged, and if someone's angry, then that is recognized. You've acknowledged it, said, I can appreciate this is hard for you at the moment. I can understand there's a lot to take in. Those sorts of phrases. Or if someone's upset, then there's a space for them to pause. Then it's not about going in and trying to fix everything, but it's just about allowing that emotion to sit there. And often what people need most is to just be treated with that respect and that patience, and to be allowed to express those emotions. And you might also say something like, if you've got any questions, if there's anything I can clarify, then please, I'm here for you. I'm here to support you. So you're giving the individual the opportunity, however they might be reacting, to let them know that it's your role to support them, that if there's anything they don't understand, because perhaps those emotions and those reactions are because they're confused, then you're there, and you might not be able to answer the question in the moment, but you can take that away. And a question that is quite powerful, and if that's appropriate at the time, is, what do you need from me right now? Or what do you need right now? Because you're putting the emphasis back onto the individual, you're giving them a sense of agency, you're letting them know that this might feel out of control, but if there's something that they need, if there's just one thing that they can hold on to that they need, and even if that might be, I just need to take a break, then you're giving them that sense of ownership, and they know that you're here for them for whatever they might need that is practical and possible for you to do within the process. And of course, the meeting is only really the start, because a lot of people will reflect on what they've heard. They'll go home, they'll think about it, they'll talk to their family, start thinking about what happens next. And of course, that's where good outplacement support can make a big difference. But one of the things that is really important outside of the formal meetings, that managers are visible, that managers are present, they're available, and that they're checking in on people, particularly if there has been an emotional reaction in the meeting that they've had. Because redundancy can feel like something that's been done to someone. And when you're offering that support outside of the meetings, or offering outplacement support, then it helps people to regain some control. It helps to reduce some of that isolation and let them know that they're not alone. And importantly, it's about that dignity and that respect to support someone through what can be a difficult time in their career. And another group of people that can be going through that grief process are the people who remain in the organisation, the people who aren't directly impacted, because they can be grieving the loss of their colleagues, the loss of their friends. They can be grieving the loss of what was an organisation that they knew and were familiar with, or a job for them that's changing. So there can be things happening all around where the people who remain are just asked to carry on with business as usual. And there can be a disconnect there for some of those survivors, as they're called. So they can be going through their own version of grief. And in the same way that you're going to support somebody who's going through a redundancy process and experience some strong emotions, then asking and expecting leaders to acknowledge what somebody who remains in the organisation might be going through, rather, well, you're lucky that you haven't been made redundant. You've still got a job. So, what's the problem? It's not about, it's about, again, saying, I recognise this has been difficult for you. We've lost some talented colleagues. It's been a difficult time. And it's okay if things feel a bit unsettled for a while. let's keep the communication open, let's keep talking and keep checking in because this is new territory for all of us, or something like that. So whilst you might have the spreadsheet, you might have everything arranged and organised and the timelines, etc., it's just remembering that at the heart of this, you're dealing with somebody who's going to be experiencing loss, and that may present itself as grief. And so when you think about supporting someone who might be grieving, then it just encourages conversations to slow down, to make sure that language is really clear, and that empathy increases as well, which is hugely important when someone is experiencing redundancy. Because yes, redundancies are necessary. They are a necessary part of organisational life. But how you lead through that is always a choice. And as Maya Angelou said, and I love these words, and you may have heard them before, is that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So people aren't going to remember the words of the business rationale, but they will remember when they felt respected, whether they felt dismissed or whether they felt seen. So closing this, I'm thinking that maybe the question isn't how do we manage redundancy well, but how do we lead people through loss? And just thinking about that shift in perspective. Because if we recognise that what we're witnessing and dealing with is grief and not that resistance or that overreaction or someone being dramatic, then something changes in how you show up as a HR leader and how leaders show up themselves. And that really is where the key to being able to support someone on an individual level as an individual person experiencing redundancy in their own way and helping to lead and guide and support them through that process. That's what they remember about the lasting impressions of their organisation when things were difficult and when you as a leader had to make difficult decisions. So I hope that's been a helpful episode just to talk about grief, thinking about that as a different perspective leading through redundancy. There's lots of information on my website. There's a link in the show notes there to other podcast episodes, to blogs to help you support line managers leading through redundancy. And also, if you want to take a deeper dive into anything related to managing redundancies, I also do a monthly free 1-hour lunch and learn with a colleague where we dive into different aspects of the technical side of managing redundancies. Everyone is welcome, and it'd be lovely to see you there. So until next time, thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.